Um, Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us at this Centre for Policy Studies webinar. And hello to John McTernan, confirming that they are all hidden, former Blair advisor, who's joining us. As I don't think anyone needs an introduction to either Andrew Sullivan or what's just happened, but I'll give one anyway. We've had the most exciting US election in days. Everyone in the UK got very, very familiar with CNN's stream of adverts for Richard Quest's show and the intricacies of all of the different counties and cities and watch the results clear up until we finally do have a winner. There is no one who is going to be more interesting on what's just happened and what happens next than Andrew Sullivan. He is one of the very greatest journalists this country has produced, who cracked America fairly early on, and has been a sort of extremely accomplished writer and editor. He is also one of the most interesting thinkers in journalism. He is a man who is completely willing to say what he thinks and to contradict the orthodoxy of his own party. Even though he's on the centre right, he was one of the leading campaigners successfully for the introduction of gay marriage in the US. He was also one of the relatively few people on the Republican side who was adamant that Donald Trump did not have the moral character to be president of the United States. So he's obviously been quite a happy man in the last few days. So he is also, more importantly than any of these, he is the author of a Centre for Policy Studies pamphlet in the 1980s on greening the Tories, proving A, that he is an incredibly far-sighted individual, given that David Cameron would do exactly what he said 15 years later, but also that there is nothing new under the sun when it comes to policy. In fact, I was just saying to Andrew when I was digging through the archives to find this, which is the last remaining copy, the next report to it was complaining about the regulatory burdens on business and how they need to be lowered in order for Britain to thrive in future. So today, we're going to focus on the US election, but I'm sure the conversation will go more widely. And let's start, Andrew. So in Andrew's latest, having been a slight victim of cancel culture in his role as a columnist, Andrew has started a really good newsletter. He's resurrected his old blog, The Dish, as a Substack newsletter for which you can subscribe to, and please do. And in his post-election, it also has a free tier which skinflints like me can sign up to. But in his the probably the best starting point is in your sort of column in your last email. Your title was Trump has gone, but Trumpism has just arrived. Do you want to flesh that out, and then we'll go from there?
Well, I think the obvious thing is that many of us were quite shocked. I mean, it's a little like a kind of weird version of 2017, which is as much that Biden has won this election, obviously, quite clearly, by about 3%, but we were told he was going to win by 7 or 8%. And we were also told that there was no such thing as a shy Trump voter, that they'd exhausted all that stuff. And what we found was that, in fact, there are two incredibly motivated movements in the country on both sides, that what you saw was one of the biggest turnouts. Well, I think maybe in terms of absolute numbers, the biggest turnout ever in American history. Everybody was motivated. They all went to the polls, and this country is completely deadlocked. It would be, I think, very silly to think of this as what we hoped it would be, or some of us hoped it would be, which is a complete repudiation of Trump. It wasn't a repudiation of Trump. It was a sign that I think the country is very evenly divided. There was lots of Biden voters who didn't vote down ballot. There were lots of Republicans who voted down ballot who didn't vote for Trump. And what happened was that essentially there was few people in the middle moved to Biden as a president, while not obviously demonstrating some massive transformation in the way people think in America, or indeed the politics that are at stake. There didn't seem to be an overwhelming message. COVID wasn't that significant. It turns out that the regions with the highest new cases of COVID correlated with big support for Trump, which is counterintuitive. We've also found out. We also realized that this figure who's been denounced as a white supremacist for 4 years, and in which the media entirely framed him in terms of white power and racial politics, won more, so far as we can tell from the early exit polls, and we have to be careful about them, but they're there, and they do show, and we know for sure that he did really well, much better with Latinos than he did in 2016. So
and you highlighted a survey showing that although it's quite limited evidence that the gay vote almost doubled, or the LGBT vote.
That's what we did. The gay vote doubled. The vote from Black women doubled. From a very small. Let's not get ridiculous here, but there were still small numbers of Black women. Only 8%, I think. But Black men in particular also went up to, I think, 18% support, which is the highest vote by non-whites for Republicans since 1960, since before the Civil Rights Act. That's when the Republicans were essentially pro-civil rights and had not adopted the Nixon strategy. So that's kind of astonishing. And it's interesting to see that Asians too, African Americans and Latinos, especially Latinos, a very solid third of the vote, perhaps more than that. And in places like Southwest Texas, border country, which went dramatically towards Trump. Very interesting shift there. And so a very surprising election, but also one that showed that even when you have what I regard as a completely crazy person at the top of the ticket, the possibility of going back to the old politics seems to be remote. And the result is obviously it's worrying. It's the first time ever that a president has behaved this way in response to a democratic election. Although it's something that most of us predicted, because it's completely consonant with the rest of his personality, character, and record.
And I mean, one of the sort of the interesting aspects of this was the way that the Republicans kind of weaponized AOC and the left wing. Sorry, there's some child noises in the background. This is, despite the attractive banner, this is obviously being filmed in my bedroom because we are under lockdown. But there was a great Onion story which I kind of captured this, which lifelong Republican voter tells family he's voting Biden for the first time just to get them to shut up. And there was a stat saying, like, I think 19% of Trump voters or something kind of really quite high basically said they didn't tell anyone they were voting for Trump, but because they felt they'd just get it in the neck. I mean, there's a sense that as we saw in the UK quite recently, the woke left wing kind of culture war agenda not only doesn't resonate, but actually does kind of terrify quite a lot of people in the centre.
What's interesting about that is that, and Eric Kaufman, whom you may know of, he's a British political scientist. He wrote this really interesting book called White Shift. He noted that compared with the polling beforehand, the group that seemed to have been most surprisingly pro-Trump, the ones you didn't expect, were in fact college-educated white voters, and not non-college. They stayed roughly, but they missed among college-educated whites the Trump vote. And I think by far the most plausible explanation for that, they didn't want to admit to pollsters that they were voting for Trump, because the atmosphere in the country at large, and certainly in somebody's workplace, for example, openly professing support for Trump, especially its last 9 months, made you fear for your job, made you fear for your livelihood. And so the same pressures that have sort of suppressed certain views in the general public have come back to bite liberals. And that's why they were really kind of shocked by how resilient the hostility to the left has been. And I do think that AOC, to some extent, was a problem for them. And it's interesting to see that the Biden kept rather smartly the notion that he was going to present himself as some sort of neutral uniter, someone who was going to be boring again, someone who would take us back to some kind of level of normalcy, and someone who was also going to listen to science and not be quite such a incredibly unpredictable and unstable figure at the center of the country. And that he was by far the most appealing to your relative middle, moderate, maybe liberal Republicans, queasy white college people. He was okay. And so what happened really, I think, is that the politics of the country hasn't changed that much. I mean, the Republicans have gained in the House, and I think they will control the Senate. It's impossible to imagine, I think, that both Georgia runoffs are going to go to the Democrats. I just doesn't seem that plausible to me. I mean, who knows? Things happen. So in fact, strategically, what's happened is they've just taken Trump out, put Biden in, and then told the Democrats, be careful, don't push it. And the question now is whether Trump can, that Biden can diffuse the situation so that his ability to chart some kind of moderate position will not be completely overwhelmed by the polarization we've had in the past.
I mean, I think there's an interesting parallel here with the UK, where essentially, you know, Ed Miliband loses on what was then quite a to the left of where the Labour Party had been platform, and those like me would go, well, obviously, you know, you need to move back towards the centre, and the Labour movement goes, no, that is the end of compromise. Compromise has failed us. We need purity. And when some of us pointed out this on Twitter, Owen Jones, bless him, set his winged monkeys on us because
he did what on us?
He set his winged monkeys. You know, fly, my pretties, fly.
Okay, yes. I of all people should get the Wizard of Oz reference, but I now get it. Sorry, go on.
But I was going to ask something different because you referred obviously to how spectacularly ungracious Trump has been about this process. I mean, how much damage do you think that does or could do? Because it's very easy to see millions of people reading these tweets and going, he's right. This was a fraud. He was stolen, and then trying to do something about that.
Yeah, I mean, it shows you how dangerous this person is. I think ungracious doesn't really capture it. This is a function of a really severe level of denial and delusion. I mean, this is a man who I think genuinely cannot psychologically comprehend absorbing a loss, and so cannot be persuaded that he did lose. And what's interesting about the challenges, apart from the fantastic Four Seasons landscaping company, which is something out of, like, I don't think Iannucci could have come up with that, in the middle of which Giuliani has to address questions of telling him that they've actually just announced the winner.
Yes, for those haven't, I thoroughly recommend the Italian report on this, from which you find out that the Italian for next to a sex shop is Presca un sexy shop. Which is it's between between a crematorium and a sex shop is really where Trump now is in a way. But let's not, I mean, again, and this sums up the question with Trump. It's like, for God's sake, on one side we have the leader of a major party who just lost an election by not a massive amount, openly assaulting the very process of a democratic election. That's one thing no one ever does. And even you could say, well, we have these queries, even though when you get down to it and look at what they're complaining about, it turns out to be almost nothing. And they don't have the evidence. They do not have basic relevant evidence for saying that this has been fraudulent. And yet the statement is that the entire system has been rigged. To tell the American people that their entire electoral system is rigged in advance and in conspiracy with the mainstream media is simply staggering in terms of the attack upon mainstream norms. And so it's hard to know whether to laugh at this or to be horrified by it. And that's really been the question for the last several years. And when people turn around to me and say, you were hysteric about this guy, you were far too upset about him, you suffered from TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, he's really not that big a deal, he's just a bit of a loudmouth, don't worry about him. I'm like, well, fine, but
what are we supposed to do when a president is violating the rule of law? What are we supposed to do when the president tells his attorney general to go after certain people? What are we supposed to do when he refuses anybody in his administration to appear before the Congress? What are we supposed to do when he announces a national emergency, which is clearly fake, purely for political purposes? I mean, these are such violations. Or when he asks a foreign government to open investigation into his opponent.
Launches his campaign from the White House. I mean, yes, there are.
It's just one after another after another. And no, I mean, launching a campaign from the White House is one thing, but denying the legitimacy of the democracy that you're in, and violating the rule of law, and directing the Justice Department to persecute your enemies, to campaigning on locking up your opponents. You can take this with a pinch of salt if you want. And I think probably in the end, he was 90% bluff and bullshit, if you pardon the expression. But no, in a democracy, it's a mark of terrible decadence when we're able to dismiss these attacks on our democratic system as a joke. It's just not a joke. It's never a joke.
So one of the things one of the things I sort of, whenever I watch the American election or even just like the party conventions or whatever, and listening to you now, one of the things about America, which is like, is the level, the belief in America, the kind of that the shining city on a hill, the ideal, like people, like, you know, in a way that you could absolutely not say in the UK because of that layer of cynicism and distance which we cover everything with. Even Biden's campaign was essentially America is a great country and it deserves a decent president. I mean,
it's true. It's true. And one of the things that kept me here is that I'm naturally not that cynical. I'm naturally kind of pretty passionate about stuff. I love the concept. I mean, I'm also a political theorist, so I'm particularly fascinated by the way that the American Constitution was set up and created, this giant, I would say, small c conservative network that created the most dynamic and vibrant country on earth in many ways. And yes, we kind of do believe in it. We actually believe naively in this system and get very upset when people come in there and violate it. And I think that's a good thing in general. I think we shouldn't all be post everything. We shouldn't be so resigned to kind of cynical reality that we can't stand up for certain basic principles without sounding jaded.
But I think this is one of the most fascinating. One of the reasons why the whole left-wing woke agenda is such a threat to, or such a challenge to, and it's so because it's. But in both Britain and America and everywhere else, its fundamental thesis is that our societies are tainted at the root. That from a crooked timber, nothing could ever grow straight. That there are these original sins of slavery, racism, imperialism, colonialism. Which mean that the entire edifice is absolutely rotten, and that nothing. And nothing can ever be good enough to. Those can never be resolved because the people who are in charge and resolving those are the inheritors of that tainted legacy.
Yes, that's true, and it's a very American thing too, to declare the whole thing rotten and have to be torn down and started over. I mean, look at Tom Paine to begin with, or also I think the more relevant is that Americans, and this is I think a more basic, the way the woke movement actually functions. America has always been a place where people, because in fact the government does not impose religion or have any sense of religion or commonality, and because the First Amendment guarantees everybody the ability to say whatever they want, there is this tradition of enforcing unanimity socially from the ground up. Tocqueville noticed this too. This is the country of the Salem witch trials, in which the purity, this is, in some ways, I think Harvard has just returned to its roots as a Puritan indoctrination centered. That if you look at the Protestant roots of purist politics in America, and that's also where abolitionism came from. It's also, if you look at something like the Hollywood blacklist in the 30s, if you think of the tradition of the Scarlet Letter, this is Americans stigmatizing each other, persecuting each other, because they don't have a huge government to enforce. They do it themselves. And so I think of the woke movement, or what I call the Great Awakening, as a parallel to something like the Great Awakening. I mean, there have been movements in America in the past that have been morally purist movements that have sought to purge evil and force people to believe certain things, directed not by the government, but by the people. And that is what's partly going on, that moralistic, puritanical strain in America.
And you obviously, so I mean, sorry to trespass on tender ground, but our viewers may not be as familiar with this as someone in America. You were essentially axed as a columnist because 30 years ago, you edited a magazine which debated the question of whether there is a genetic component to IQ. You didn't endorse this theory yourself. You published a series of, I think it might have been Robert Putnam was the main article, and then a series of commentaries on it. And for refusing to apologise for having published this edition of a magazine 30 years ago, you were essentially, your younger colleagues at the magazine felt uncomfortable with your presence. As part of.
Yes, I mean, that's what happened. I mean, that in 1994, when I was editing the New Republic, Charles Murray and Richard Hertzstein put out this book, The Bell Curve, which was all about, actually 95% of it was about class and genetics and the growing gulf in America between the cognitive elite and most people, which in fact was a fascinating, I think quite prescient view of what was going to happen in America and what was already happening there. But it also touched the obvious third rail of race and genetics. And that was coming out by the Free Press. And I thought, well, I'm editing the New Republic, which was kind of like the Spectator in terms of it sort of being a buzzy. Hold on one second. Let me just make sure this stops. Someone just started a vacuum. Hold on.
I should say, while Andrew deals with his domestics, I'll be switching to audience questions very soon. We've already got quite a few coming in, but if you have anything else to ask, please do. I'll try and get through as many as possible.
I'm also at home, so when my cleaning lady just started the vacuum, I had to wait a little bit. So I apologize for that. Yeah. Well, anyway, so. But everybody knew that. I've worked at major magazines since then. I'd worked at The Atlantic. I'd worked at Time. I was hired by New York Magazine with this in my past. It had always been part of it. My view was that we should debate this question. And I had one piece making the case, and then literally 13 other pieces criticizing it, put it out as a symposium, and I've been a Nazi ever since, and a white supremacist and all the other things. And I'm just not woke, and I don't buy the premises or the neo-Marxist principles of it or the philosophical foundations of it. And I think it's opposed to basic liberalism, by which I mean the classical liberalism and the limited government. So, and then what happened increasingly as I took on the woke at New York, the Me Too movement about it being too puritanical and very much McCarthyite in some of its emphases, and then the Black Lives Matter, which I argued was really rooted in an analysis that was not really borne out by the stats at all. And so eventually the younger staffers, the millennials, began to revolt. I had people go to HR to say that just having me write for the magazine made it an unsafe work environment. Even though I live in Washington, not New York, I never go into the office. I have almost no interaction with the regular staffers, and eventually I thought we could get through the election and then I could move on somewhere, but I'd already been concerned that this could happen. It was happening to everybody who wasn't fully woke in American media. I mean, we've had an unbelievable purge of some, and not just from one political direction, from every political direction, who won't kowtow to this. When they're going after Glenn Greenwald and me, we're obviously not ideologically the same. We're just writers who want to say what the hell we think, and who don't think that's a crime. And I think that people are upset by it, then it's their problem, not ours. And maybe they have a better argument and come back at me, but don't go behind our backs and go to HR and say this person is evil and wicked. And then there was a social media campaign against the usual stuff. And so I then went back to my old, I'd already been, I'd always have been since 2000, I have an independent place online. And it had been, and we had 1 million readers a month by 2015 at the Daily Dish. So I had that base already. I went to them and I said, let me write this myself and give you what I want. And we just hit over 15,000 paid subscribers and 85,000 signups. And the latest piece got 400,000 views. So, and my salary has tripled.
Which is fantastic for you, but unfortunately only works if you're Andrew Sullivan and you have the.
I know.
If you're the 20-something Andrew Sullivan, you're going to knuckle down because
you're really screwed, and it's a terrible thing.
So the questions are piling up, and we're probably not going to get through all of them. But one thing just to on the, I'm just going to read from your newsletter because I think it's a really interesting point. You said. What was cemented in place this week is a new GOP, not unlike the new Tories in the UK. They're nationalist, culturally conservative, geared towards the losers of capitalism as well as its winners, mildly protectionist and isolationist. It speaks in a language that working class Americans understand, and it devoid of the woke neologisms of the educated elites. And it seems to me that this is a far more settled and electorally potent coalition than what we see now among the Democrats. And actually, so one of the comments someone made was, Jonathan Chait was saying this isn't actually a settled coalition, but so there's an interesting contrast in your views there. But I mean, that parallel between the US and the UK is effectively this feels like a Remain versus Leave kind of election in the US in the same way that there is that divide on very, very similar kind of cultural, economic, geographical, class, education, those kind of things. It's a new battle and age more in the UK than the US, but it feels like a new battle, sort of a refashioning of the Republicans as with the Tories as a kind of working class party.
Yes, and that's when I was over in Britain last November, December, before the British election. What was stunning to me, and not just in terms of the actual data and the actual arguments, but this feeling of a very evenly divided country, a 52-48, depending upon the day, that was, culturally and psychologically different, and resonating very differently on class lines and indeed partly on racial lines. And it is, except here, of course, we have divided government, so we can have a Leave president and a Remain Senate, or vice versa. What we have is a Remain president, a less Remain House, and a still Republican Senate, and then we have a judiciary that Trump has packed in the perfectly legitimate term, has filled with conservative judges. We have the Supreme Court itself. By a fluke, really. I mean, very few presidents get 3, and he got 3 in 4 years. And so that's why we're deadlocked. I mean, until there's some way to bridge these divides and to talk to one another in a way that makes sense. And I think Biden's promise is that he could lower the emotional temperature sufficiently so that we can talk to each other again, so that we can actually see each other as human beings, and people whose views, regardless of what they are, we should respect, even when we disagree with. And it's incredibly hard to get to right now. And it's going to be Biden's fundamental challenge. And McConnell, in the Senate, I think is going to be able to tell him yes or no. And so I hope that McConnell can find some ways in which they can cooperate, whether that be on infrastructure investment, whether it be on a stimulus for the COVID recession. He should be able to budge, but McConnell is, talk about recalcitrant. I mean, he tried his best to kill off Obama from the get-go. Just that is part of the problem. The tribalism is so deep, and to be honest with you, I think the tribalism was deeper and worse among Republicans before it got so bad among Democrats.
So there's lots and lots of questions. I'll try and pinball around between them. John McTernan, who, as I mentioned, was an advisor to Tony Blair, points out that the Republicans have only won the popular vote once since 1988. If the swing states in the future are in the Sun Belt, Georgia and Arizona, what does a successful Republican strategy look like? Bush 2004? Question mark.
Yeah, something like that. But not we're on to take away your Social Security, which is what Bush was doing in 2004, and also not Bush, who managed to run on opposition to marriage equality in 2004 to win Ohio. Look, this is absolutely right that that the Democrats seem to have a built-in popular vote advantage in the country, and the way in which the Electoral College and indeed the Senate work has been, really problematic in the 21st century, in as much as it has given us two presidencies that were not winning the popular vote, and that's always going to be destabilizing. It didn't happen at all in the 20th century, but I would say this. The American Constitution, the Electoral College, and the Senate were there. They're doing what they were supposed to do, which is the founders were worried that what could happen in America is that just the big coastal cities would have so much demographic power, they could basically dictate the fate of the nation, that all those people spread out in the middle of the country could be completely ignored, that people would only campaign in the big cities and rack up big numbers there. And that people would ignore the center of the country. So you could say, on the one hand, from the vantage point of pure democracy, this is a disgrace. And that is where many of the Democrats now are saying, look, we need to fix the system. I would argue the system is doing what it was supposed to do, which is keeping the interests of the rural, the heartland voters, we're giving them sort of artificial strength vis-a-vis the big cities. That was what the design was to begin with, and that's what's continuing. And to be honest, I think, if we'd had just simply democratic rule without the middle of the country being able to vent, being able to be represented, to feel they were part of the process, it would be more dangerous. So I'm not pessimistic. But the thing is also this idea of a permanent democratic majority because of demographics keeps receding every time. Latino voters right now, this last election, voted more like white voters than ever before. Why? Because that's what Americans always do. Every immigrant group aspires to be part of the mainstream, and Latinos are clearly part of that. They're not. We keep thinking of them as minorities, but in fact, they want to be part of the majority, socially and culturally.
And Robert Mars asks, how significant is it that the Democrats haven't gained control of the Senate? I mean, there's some talk about Mitch McConnell sort of, blocking left-wing appointments to cabinet, etc. But presumably, I mean, while there will be talk about working together and holding hands in harmony, we are in for it feels like we're in for a repeat of Obama from 2010, when basically he, instead of computer says no, it was Senate says no.
Yeah, and that's likely to happen. I mean, certainly in terms of the bigger ambitions of Biden, they're done, unless he can manage to wangle them for before the midterms, if he can have. And yes, it dramatically changes the policy variables for the next 4 years.
Very good question from Randall Heather. If a vaccine had been announced 2 weeks ago instead of today, would Trump have won?
No, because COVID turned out to be not that big an issue. And that's what's interesting. And maybe he could have spun it to that, but it'd be very hard for him to claim credit for a vaccine. Although, as I said earlier, he predicted that immediately he lost the election, a vaccine would come in, because he thought it was some sort of grand plot to keep it from him. But of course, that's not the case. And it turns out that Pfizer isn't that interested in cooperating with Operation Warp Speed, which Trump put into practice. But we still have. We have a vaccine, and we have two and a half months of Trump being president. So he's going to have to preside over the implementation of a vaccine if that happens.
A couple of questions about Biden. A couple of them are just asking, what do you expect from a Biden premiership? How influenced do you think he'll be by the left? And then a couple more specifically asking about foreign policy and in particular the relationship with the UK. So, I mean, would you be okay to take each one in turn?
Sure. It all depends how Biden himself understands what happened. He seems from the beginning of the campaign to have realized he's not going to run as being this transformational progressive icon, even though I think he has a sense that if he had the majority and he was at this moment, he would use it for some real structural reform. We need very badly solid infrastructure investment right now in America, and it should be something that both sides can agree on. It's something that Trump said he was going to do and failed to do. Look, but I think in foreign policy we will have a return to roughly Obama foreign policy, and I just hope to God we don't have another war somewhere. So
the pivot to Asia again, the more skepticism of Russia, fairly obviously.
Yes. And what's interesting with the Democrats is how the China relationship is being understood, and in general, I think the genocidal impulses against the Uyghurs has shifted understanding, as well as a general sense that the Democrats have that Trump was kind of right about China, and they were kind of wrong. I just hope to God the crazies that think Russia is behind everything can chill out and recognize, no, don't turn that into a fixation. As for the UK, again, there are people, it's really shocked really to see Ben Rhodes come out and say some of the things he's saying about Boris. I'm going to have a word with him. It's just that there's a caricature out there. I wrote a big piece about Boris for the Americans last December to try and say this whole thing that he's Trump misses way more than it captures. But we'll see if Ben's there driving it. They're certainly not going to be that pro-Brexit, these people. And they're going to be more oriented towards Germany. They sort of, but Merkel's going too, so who knows where that ends up. But Biden, remember, is still nonetheless of the generation in Washington that just treats the special relationship as part of the core foundation of, they want their Churchill busts and they want their Anglophilia. And, Biden has a lot of Irish roots, obviously, and he's that's part of who he is. But no, he's not going to be viscerally anti-UK. I don't think, personally.
And in terms of his domestic agenda and being captured by the left, do you think he can continue to keep that distance, or are they going to want their pound of flesh?
They definitely want their pound of flesh. I mean, there's no question they are on the warpath. There's going to be a moment when he's going to define himself, and he has to, I think, figure out how to finesse that. My concern is that because legislatively he's going to be somewhat hamstrung, there could be all sorts of wokeness happening in places like the education department, the justice department, and that some of the administrative state, as it were, as well as many, many political appointees will be attempting to drag him to the left. And if the four things he talks about, COVID, the economy, climate change, and then systematic racism, as he calls it, if they're stymied on the first three and go for the last, then when God help us, then the resistance is going to be extremely tight. We're going to get obviously a Republican House next time around, and he's going to have less leeway in 2 years than he does even now.
And in terms of the future of the Republicans, again, there's sort of multiple questions on this, which I'm sort of wrapping together. So apologies to people that I'm not reading off their questions specifically. So some people are asking, has the Trump presidency done damage to how much damage has the Trump presidency done to the Republican brand? Others are saying, how does a Trump without Trump win? Does Trumpism without Trump actually win more easily? I was struck by I think it link might even be in your newsletter to someone who wrote next time we actually might get a competent authoritarian rather than.
Well, yes, I would say this, that what Trump has done with respect to the presidency is that he has broken some core guardrails that remain broken because precedents are precedents. And the ability to bracket him and say, this can't happen in the future, that was something Trump did, and therefore impermissible in the future, I'm not sure is holding, which is exactly how republics generally disintegrate, because norms are violated, and it's very hard, it's easier to break a norm than to restore it.
But in terms of the Republican Party, I mean, someone's pointing out, Trumpism did better than McCainism. It did better than Romneyism, even with and Trump, like, let's. I mean, there is a kind of myth about Trump. I think, as with the UK election in 2019, Boris Johnson was actually a relatively unpopular candidate. It's just he was up against, as from a historical perspective in terms of his favourability, he was just up against Hillary. He was up against Jeremy Corbyn. Donald Trump was a historically speaking a very unpopular Republican candidate who was up against Hillary Clinton.
Yes, and that helped a lot. No, the question to me is: there's clearly a viable Republican majority or coalition around Trumpism, as it were, as you read from my piece earlier about what that would mean. The question in all our minds is: does that kind of populist conservatism need a larger-than-life sort of figure who's a sort of TV star, an outsider, a Boris or a Beppe, as it were? And Trump is the American version of that. And without Trump, could a figure like Josh Hawley or Tom Cotton or Nikki Haley manage to summon up that same level of awful resentment of everything educated and elite? And I think, yes, I don't see why not. I mean, politics is politics, and individuals matter and personalities matter. But yeah, I think that there is more coherence currently on the right than on the left.
And you mentioned Nikki Haley and Josh Hawley. Are there any other sort of Republican names we should look out for, aside, of course, from the junior members of the Trump family?
Well, that's the truth. Is that who knows where the Trump cult is going to go? And so I think it'd be foolish to speculate. Is he going to be a sort of king in exile, spending his time like Pope Benedict, trashing Pope Francis?
The latest question just says Trump in 2024 ?
It's completely possible. And if that were to happen, I think it would probably break up the Republican Party. I mean, I think if he weren't going to get it, he'd be a third party candidate. And as a third party candidate, he would empower the Democrats. And look, it's true that he's going to have a big base, but the truth is also the country is exhausted by him. I mean, it's like being, I said this before, it's like being in a household with a mentally ill father who can do anything at any moment. In the end, you all become mentally ill because you have to cope with this. And to have someone at the very center who is completely delusional and impulsive and unstable and capable of doing and saying anything, to have that anchor your entire society is incredibly destabilizing and nerve-wracking, and I think psychologically damaging for so many people. I mean, I know people laugh when I say this, but no, this man has been in my head for 5 years, and he is a nightmare of a human being. I mean, he's an abusive, we've all been in an abusive relationship with this man, and we've been defined by it. We've been turned crazy by it. I mean, that's one hope, that by removing Trump, the left won't have such an obvious piñata, won't be able to justify their extreme views about America. Because in the case of Donald Trump, they're not wrong a lot of the time. But Trump is not most Americans. Most Americans are not that nuts. I mean, if I came across someone like Trump, have you ever, does anybody come across people like this in their regular life? If you do, and they start saying the sky is red today, you just slowly edge out of the room. And this is, you realize that's the nutter on the bus. We had the nutter on the bus running us for like 4 years.
Well, we had him leading the Labour Party, so there's
But you put him in government, and remember that it's fucking it's a nightmare.
Trump is presumably not going to fade away, but equally, you're not going to have to watch his TV show or.
I can do what I did before, which is keep him a little bit out of my consciousness and go a few days without thinking of this person.
So a question. So Charles Kingsley Evans says, "Happy memories of your Oxford days," and hello.
Oh my gosh, yes.
He also wonders what the Kennedy family, and indeed you, make of the second Catholic president.
Am I supposed to channel the Kennedy family just because I have some relations with them? What was the question again?
Are you happy to have another Catholic president?
Well, yes, I mean, Catholics are running the country. I mean, we control the entire Supreme Court now and the presidency. No, it's one of the things that Biden did for me anyway is that I know this guy. He's a very familiar guy. He's the Irish Catholic uncle who goes off a bit at Christmas, but who's got a heart of gold. And certainly if you have any Irish Catholic background, he's an incredibly familiar figure. And I think a lot of those white Catholics in the Midwest really that resonated with them. And look, he's a good guy, Biden. He's just a decent person, and more than decent. He's actually a really kind person. And I just mean that without any political judgment of that. I think people just wanted to have someone who wasn't quite so repellent in every way in the White House.
Shifting tack slightly, I had a couple of questions on the Great Awakening, Black Lives Matter. I mean, which sort of boiled down to a question asked by Alex Morton from our team. Why aren't you more scared? I mean, what's happened to? This is meant to be the country which is the whole, the home of freedom of speech. If America's not going to stand up for the idea that people should can say what they think, then where will? And authoritarian regimes can point to this kind of stuff. It's
the reason I'm not as scared as I might be, and maybe I'm going to be proven wrong. And I've already had people na-na-na-ing me about my defense of voting for Biden, which I proudly did. The sources of wokeness are not coming from the top of the federal government. There was these critical race theory trainings, but no, it's not where government is not where this is coming. It's coming from Google. It's coming from Facebook. It's coming from all the major corporations. It's coming from the universities. It's part of civil society that this is happening, as opposed to a government top-down thing. Government will eventually respond, and there are places and cities where this is happening. But no, this is a battle that we can't delegate to some political leader. This is something we have to fight and engage with in the civil sphere and change minds in the civil sphere. And I think we're beginning to do that. We had a sort of moral hysteria this summer. And I hope, again, with the temperature declining, we could have more reasonable and rational. But I note this, in California, the initiative that would reimpose the ability for the government to discriminate by race, in other words, the affirmative action, was defeated. That in fact, whenever it's put to a vote, wokeness loses. The experience that we've seen in places like Portland and Seattle of this lawlessness has been terribly stigmatizing, I think, for aspects of that. And I do think the fight back in the media against wokeism is going in full flood. Substack is a part of it. So I don't like to get scared.
That actually brings us to another question which someone's asked about fake news. I mean, isn't there a worry that how do you bring a country together if everyone is following their own channel? And I mean, obviously, people who follow Andrew Sullivan's channel are wise and enlightened and will be fully informed. But people who follow
Alex Jones.
Yeah, I mean, Alex Jones, Donald Trump Jr., Donald Trump Sr. They're going to get on the left-wing equivalent, so are going to get a very sort of. It's going to be quite hard. The points we have in common as societies do begin to.
Well, for 4 years we've had the leader of the country stoke this division every day deliberately to provoke it, to benefit from it. If we remove that person, if we put at the head of it a slightly more boring person who constantly tells us, like most presidents do, we need to come together, it may be that we can start to unwind this. If we don't unwind it, we're headed to civil war at some level. And I think there is an exhaustion out there. And we'll see. Obviously, I can't predict. And I'm obviously extraordinarily concerned about critical theory and postmodern thought coming to undermine the essential liberal project in America. But that's an intellectual and cultural fight. It's not necessarily a political one.
Our questions are conveniently grouping themselves into groups. So I'm getting through as many as I can in multiple questions. So three topics where there's been more than one question. What's Biden's relationship with business going to be like? What does Biden mean for business and the tech and regulation and things? Should we change the electoral college? And what do you make of the new vice president? You know, is she going to be a bridge builder, or is she going to be the kind of and is she going to position herself? So, you know,
awful,
we've got 7 minutes left. So I figured you could take whichever one of those, or all three of them in order.
Look, think of Obama's relationship with business. That's what you're going to get with Biden. There's not going to be Elizabeth Warren did not win the nomination. She would not have won the election. I don't see anything that dramatic. I think that's why, you know, people are kind of bullish.
Not even in terms of regulating big tech, which is obviously a huge and increasingly salient.
We'll see where that happens. I'll be perfectly honest. I don't know where he's going to lean on that. I mean, there are obviously people wanting to regulate it more. There are other forces at work. I don't know where Biden's gut is on that. It's such a new topic. I'm not sure he's clued into it. Harris is, I think, a mediocrity. And irritates me intensely in many ways. She put out this awful video just before the election talking about equity. And I mean, she's so full of crap half the time. But, you know, we also don't know how Biden's health and vitality is gonna stack up, or who else he's going to put in the cabinet who could vie with her for the 2024 nomination. Biden's strength, if you think of this as 2010 with Obama, in terms of is that partly they've experienced that and they can see what happens to the Republicans. It didn't work out that well for them. But the difference between Biden and Obama is that Biden has spent decades in the Senate. He knows all of those people. He's genuinely well liked. There was a wonderful campaign video of Lindsey Graham, which someone cut together, of Lindsey Graham saying horrible things about Donald Trump, but then saying, and Joe Biden is the single best human being that I've ever met. Yeah, there you have it. Now, I tend to think that the senators would be, I think, relatively okay with Biden and compromising. So, for example, if they do I would recommend a big infrastructure bill where they can both claim some credit as a sort of starter kit for possible reconciliation. Some pragmatic centrist positions. But it all depends whether McConnell wants to be an asshole again. He's developed that into a fine performance art, and he doesn't really care. And good old Lindsey won by 8 points, which was again something that very few people saw coming. But poor Lindsey Graham, he's a victim of the polarization. He wants to be Joe Biden's best friend, and he wants to say all the nice bipartisan things. He's just terrified that if he does so, these Trump hordes from below are going to throw him out. But we'll see. I mean, we will absolutely see. And I think Biden may be able to pick off a handful of senators to help him get places, and may be able to achieve some of his bigger stuff through what's called reconciliation, which is a process whereby you don't need to break the filibuster in the Senate to get your budget passed. So you could pass it with 50 Democrats and 1 Republican. Although I do look forward to the Republican Party rediscovering the fact that deficits exist. And well, that's going to happen instantly. In fact, it's happening right as we speak. Having splurged unbelievably, this last 4 years makes previous Republican administrations deficit busting just like trivial in comparison. And you added this debt during the high point of a long recovery. This is the last time you should ever do it. You know, go read your Keynes. But everybody's now telling me that it doesn't matter, that you can borrow infinite amounts of money and it'll never come back to haunt you, and blah, blah, blah. I don't believe that. I think there has to become a point at which that's going to have an effect, but not right now.
And the questions about the Electoral College, I mean, are there things, you actually made a very sort of good case for why the Senate system certainly is as it is. I mean, would you, I mean, apart from counting postal votes, like before they come in so that you can tell people the result, within a day rather than within a week, are there tweaks that you'd make in terms of how the system works?
Well, I do think that it's a legitimate question that, for example, I, living where I do, have no representation in the Congress, that the 600,000 people in Washington, D.C. Who have zero representation is a problem, when Wyoming, which has roughly the same amount of people in it, has 2 senators and 1 congressperson. I do think it's an artifact of history, but I do think that's something. I also think that the people who live in Puerto Rico have a point. But that's never going to happen.
You wouldn't favour what Michael Adam suggests of doing state seats on an electoral college on a proportional basis rather than winner takes all?
I don't believe in constitutional change. Very slowly. Anyway, look, this thing has worked for a long time. The fact it's having a rough time right now doesn't mean you throw out the whole thing. In fact, as I would argue, it's actually saving the country at some level. You don't want. Look, America is designed for gridlock. If there isn't a significant majority for something, it's not going to happen.
Yes, I mean the founding fathers, as with their sort of equivalents in the UK, had a terror of the mob and of the masses.
Absolutely, a completely justified terror of the mob. But they've already sacrificed. I'm going to sound reactionary now, but they've already sacrificed things like the Senate being directly elected as outrage. You could. It seems to me that states themselves can pass laws saying that their electoral college voters will always reflect the majority vote in the state without changing the constitution at all. The individual states can do that. That I have no problem with.
And similarly, abolishing gerrymandering, and it seems like a fairly good idea if you can do it. But
one of these things where in America, we just don't have the strong centralized state. We never have. These things are state by state, and things are done by the 2 parties. What certainly happened this time around is that the Democrats' failure to retake the House, and in some cases, many state legislatures, mean that they're not going to be able to get their own people to gerrymander the next round of districts, which happens after this census.
So we're just out of time, but I'm going to ask you one final question, which is, and it goes back to that question about cynicism. I mean, in 4 years' time, do you think you'll be sitting here still? Are you optimistic that that things will get better or get worse? I mean, do you think that the trends we've been talking about, the sort of, obviously, Trump is gone, but are you, both in America and Britain, are you generally optimistic about the future, or has?
I am very moderately optimistic. I am definitely hopeful. There's a distinction, I think, between hope and optimism. I still believe that our loose constitutional democracies are the best way forward. I think that when a country is as divided as evenly as it is in the UK and the US, it is not a sign of ill health that the government is somewhat gridlocked. I mean, you guys have broken through with a real accountable majority government. But America was never going to do that. It was never going to do. It can't do that, and it's too evenly divided. So we muddle through. I hope we can muddle through without any major dangers. And I think with Trump removed, the biggest danger has been taken out of the system. The completely unpredictable, volatile, unstable, instinctually tyrannical, ugly human being. I mean, he's defined so much of us, and we'll just find out, because it's 5 years since this figure invaded all of our psyches and our collective consciousness in America and tormented us with his derangement. I just don't know how to predict how the culture will emerge and change with him removed. I personally feel this massive exhalation that he's not I don't wake up in the morning terrified of what the president might have done overnight. And I want to be able to live my life going days on end without thinking of the president. That's what I want. I don't want to live in that virtual one-party state with that bloody face is staring at me and yelling at me every day and night.
There's a parallel here with Get Brexit Done. It is basically you don't have to think about this.
The goal is like, I don't think people are going to want to dive back into Trump. I really don't. I think people are absolutely exhausted.
Well, with that, Andrew, I know it's been a long few weeks. Thank you so much for talking to us. We have a higher volume of I've tried to rattle through, but we've had more people eager to ask you questions than anyone we've had.
Oh, that's great. Can I make a pitch, please? If you enjoy this, or please, the Weekly Dish is online. We need subscribers and people to pay us and to expand and to generate a really non-tribalized media. And so any help or spreading the news over there is...
Andrew, you took the words out of my mouth. AndrewSullivan.substack.com. Please do all go to it. And I have to confess, I have lied once during this conversation, which is when I said that there is no one as qualified as Andrew Sullivan to talk us through the election. In fact, that is not true. On Friday, the only man who is equally qualified to talk us through the election, Dr. Frank Luntz, the eminent pollster, will be doing a deep dive through the data and telling us at the CPS what has happened. So please do all join us for that. The link is on the CPS website or the CPS Twitter page. But for the moment, thank you, Andrew Sullivan, so very, very much. And
you bet.
Enjoy your rest.
Thank you.